compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that is that we're at a tipping point. They've been able to do that for a pretty simple reason. Part of the genius of the American system was government just wasn't that big compared to most other places. I mean, when we think about how big government is, compared to France or Germany or Sweden and lots of other places, our government is still relatively small, or at least it used to be. And so it took longer for us to get to the point of no return than a lot of those other countries. In Greece, the government sector is something like 60%. Here, you add up state, local, federal, it's still about 40%, which is way too big. But it's taken us longer to get to this point of no return. And so, if you're a politician, you look in the rearview mirror and say, well, we've been able to get away with this. All those sort of naysayers, look, we're a wealthy country. We do pretty well. Recessions come, recessions go, but over time we get wealthier. And so, they look at you and say, what's the problem? I'll give you one other example, and then I'll go to questions. My wife works for the Minnesota House of Representatives, and one of the things that she works on, she's a researcher there, is pensions. And believe it or not, Minnesota is in much better shape than a lot of other states. We're still in not great shape, but we're in a lot better shape than some other states. But King Banyan, who's a state representative from St. Cloud, he's an economist. He sits on the pension commission and he's looking over their numbers and he says, well, I see a big problem here. We assume that we're going to get an annual rate of return of 8.5%. What's that? Yeah, exactly. On our investments, 8.5% in perpetuity in order to make the numbers work. And he says, well, are we getting 8.5%? Well, no, we're not. What are we getting now? Well, we're getting about 5%, but we're, times aren't that good. Over time, we'll get to 8.5%. And, so when did we get 8.5%? Well, when the stock market was roaring in the late 90s, and, there are a few periods of time, but we just haven't been averaging 8.5%. So he says, well, let's lower it to 7. We're getting 5 now, but the economy might pick up. He originally wanted to lower it to 6. Well, we can't do that. So he said, let's lower it to 7. And they had a big debate. And the liberals, who are very powerful on the committee, said, well, our pensions will go bankrupt if you do that. And, he said, no. Our pensions will go bankrupt because we're not getting 8.5%. All we're doing is trying to acknowledge reality so that we can change the way that we budget. We have to put more money in there because we're going to owe that money. So we should be prepared, invest that money now so that we can get that 5, 6, 7%. And they said, no, we'll go bankrupt. And, it gives you a flavor for how they think. They actually think that if they write into law that they will get an 8.5% return, that they will. And when you say, well, but it's not going to add up. 10 years from now, we're going to be in a real problem. It's like, well, I'm elected for 2. And that's the problem that we face when you're looking at government. They really seem to believe, they're either incredibly cynical, or they seem to believe that if they say it, it must be true. So, sort of wrapping things up, I think we're really at a tipping point, in the United States. And I think it's actually, the iceberg is much bigger than most people think. Europe's problems right now, ironically enough, they're not helping our economy. but they're helping our interest rates, they're helping keep our payments on the debt. I mean, one of the reasons why our budget, as big as it's gotten, hasn't completely blown up is because we're paying almost nothing right now in terms of interest on that debt. Most of the debt that the United States is carrying, something like 70–80% of it, will turn over in the next 5 years. We're selling short-term debt at 1 or 2%. And even with that, we're paying about $500 billion a year in interest rates. Well, the long-term average is closer to 4 or 5%, which could triple if it goes back up to the long-term average. Triple just our yearly payments. So you go from $500 billion a year, and you add $1 trillion on top of that. Well, we're actually kind of lucky that Greece and Europe have been having these problems, because lots of people who would have invested in bonds over there, park their money in European bonds, go, well, where's the safest place on earth right now? Well, the United States. We'll put our money in the United States of America. They're not getting any money. In fact, after inflation, they're losing money. You know, anyone who's on a fixed income knows that. You know, if you've got your money in U.S. Treasuries, it's not a good investment. But because people are scared, they figure, well, we'll pay. It's a safe investment. Well, what happens when they get their act together, or people start looking for more return on their dollars? Well, there's going to be a flight from U.S. Treasuries. And when that happens, interest rates are going to have to go up to draw that money in. It's not like we can say we're not going to sell bonds, because we can't finance the U.S. government with our taxes. So our interest rates will go up. When interest rates go up, what we have to pay every year is going to go up. And we're going to have yet another huge budget problem. I think right now, what we pay for our entire national defense is about $600 billion a year. Well, think about what would happen if we had to pay another $1 trillion. That's almost 2 defense budgets. We don't have the money. So, I mean, and we're not talking about something that's 30, 40, 50 years away. We're talking about something that could be 1, 2, 3, 4 years away. So, you know, when I look around, about the only hope that I have is groups like this. Because it's not going to be politicians. For every Paul Ryan, there are 50 or 100 people who think, well, if you lower that assumed rate of return, we're going to go bankrupt. I mean, there are almost no economists in politics. So, I mean, these are people who really think that words alone will do it. So, it's groups like this that are, you know, have the responsibility to save the United States of America from what could be very, very, very painful problem in just 2, 3, 4 years. And, you know, if the economy takes off at 5, 6, 7%,
take off yet?
Take off.
It's going to add nice soundtrack to the music.
You know, if we get an enormous amount of economic growth, we theoretically could grow our way out of the problem. But, I mean, with the federal government this size, I don't see it happening. It's sucking up the lifeblood from our economy. It's taking money from enterprises that can work and do work and giving it to the cylinders. That's not how economies work. And so Tocqueville was right. Tocqueville wrote, if you look at Tocqueville's book, it's about that thick, all right? And you know how much he wrote about America's government? Like 20 pages. Because that's not where the heart and soul of this country is. It's in their citizens. It's in the sort of voluntary organizations. And, you know, we sort of got away from that over the past 50 years. I mean, you go to an optimist club and everyone's, you know, 50 or above. We need something like spring up again, and that's the Tea Party. Now, I could encourage you to go out and buy some sleeping bags and take over a park, but but I don't have union dollars to pay you. So, anyway, with that, I would be happy to take questions. And I will talk about LGA if you ask.